Hello and welcome to Return to the Mother Online Summit, where we have gathered together wisdom keepers, theologians, spiritual teachers, and inspirational speakers to share their knowledge and insights as we explore the concept of the divine feminine, God's consciousness and earth awareness, and whether there are any interconnecting threads as to how women and anything feminine is perceived in a world that is so deeply rooted in patriarchy. My name is Frances Billinghurst, your host for and the creatrix of this event, and I'm coming to you from Kaurna country here in South Australia. So as such, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as being the traditional custodians of the lands upon which I reside, and manina padni, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am delighted to welcome Stephen Mehler. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you very much for being part of this event.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited.
And we are very honored to have you with us as well. So for anyone who's not familiar with his work, Stephen was born in New York City, where his early education focused on the sciences. In 1967, he received a BS in human physiology and anatomy with a minor in chemistry from Hunter College, City University of New York. And after spending 4 years in the US Air Force during the Vietnam conflict, he resumed his academic work, receiving an MA in natural sciences, specializing in human ecology in 1974 from the San Jose State University. In the summer of that year, Stephen had the opportunity to work on archaeological excavation in the south of France. And while working with Professor Francois Bourdes of the University of Bordeaux, who was also the director of antiquities in southeast France, Stephen developed a love for archaeology and geology. Having a strong interest in ancient Egypt that I'm quite sure Stephen's going to talk about, that he developed as a very young man, he combined all his interests and received his second MA in natural sciences, this time specializing in Egyptology from the San Jose State University in 1978. In November of 1992, he got an opportunity to visit Egypt, where he met Abdul Hakim Aliwan, an Egyptologist, an archaeologist, a senior tour guide, and more importantly, an Indigenous wisdom keeper. Becoming Hakim's main student and later colleague, Stephen and Hakim founded the discipline known as kinetology, which actually differs quite strongly from academic Egyptology. And under Hakim's guidance, Stephen wrote 2 books, The Land of Osiris, which he published in 2001, and From Light into Darkness, which was published in 2005. Over his time, he's co-led some 20 tours to Egypt from 1998 to 2018, and today lives in Lafayette, Colorado with his wife, teacher and novelist Theresa Carter, with their cat Cleopatra. So what an extensive background, Stephen, and I'm delighted because the focus of your talk today is actually going to be on matriarchy and the Great Mother, which people may not necessarily associate with the land of the pharaohs. So we are exploring these connecting threads, especially with the absence of the divine feminine, earth, Mother Earth, nature, Goddess consciousness. So we've shared a little bit about your backstory. I suppose the next step is for you to sort of weave these threads from your own background together and how you got to this subject of matriarchy.
Yes, and there's so many things we could talk about, but I'm going to focus down on that. In that you gave it an introduction.
Mm-hmm.
It really begins in the 70s, which I believe was the second wave of feminism in American history. As you said, I got out of the Air Force. I went to San Jose State University, and I became very close friends with many female anthropologists, many of whom were radical feminists. And I became a radical feminist and still am so today. And I don't consider that an insult or a derogatory term to be called a feminist, which unfortunately in the patriarchal nowadays does become a derogatory statement. So these ladies influenced me to study the subject of matriarchy. Now, at that time, even in the 1970s, anthropology, mostly dominated by men, did not consider there was ever such a thing as a true matriarchy. Well, I found out that the reason for that was not because of matriarchies, but because of their definition of matriarchy. So the more I began to study, the more I began to uncover this tremendous prehistory. Now, I want to mention a name because this is very much important. They turned me on to a man. His name was Jakob Johann Bachofen. He's known in history as J.J. Bachofen. He was a Swiss jurist born in the early 19th century. And for people to understand that feminism actually began in the early 19th century, many people do not realize that Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Frankenstein, was a feminist. So Bachhofen became a Swiss. It was born in Switzerland. He became obsessed with law. He became an outstanding jurist, one of the most outstanding jurists of the 19th century, and he became an expert in Roman law. Now, the more he studied Roman law, the more he realized that there were laws that the Romans passed that indicated that there had been a previous system that they were legislating against. In other words, men should inherit property. Men should be the leader of the home. The leader should be an emperor or a king, or the leader should be a male. And so he began to study, realize that they were talking about a previous system, which was matriarchal. And the more he studied it, the more he believed it. And he published a landmark book in 1861, which in the Swiss German is Mutterrecht. It's called Mother Right. Today, I had a paperback which called Myth, Religion, and Mother Right by Bachhofen. I read it, influenced me tremendously. I began to study the subject then and realized that he then influenced a lot of other scholars, including a lot of men in the late 19th century. A man named Robert Bruffaut, a Frenchman, who wrote a tremendous 3-volume set, almost 1,000 pages each book. You know, no television, no social media in those days. All people had to do was just read. So he called it The Mothers. There was a man named Morgan in the US who began to study indigenous Native American tribes. He realized many of them were matriarchal, including a very famous tribe, which maybe we can return to before the end of this discussion, which are known as the Haudenosaunee, which we incorrectly call the Iroquois, the 5 nations who became the 6 nations. The American system of government, instituted by James Madison, who was a disciple of Thomas Jefferson, is based on the Haudenosaunee system with English law. It's unfortunately that he incorporated English law. Otherwise, the American system would today be much more perfect than it is. And I can explain this in detail later. But anyway, there were many scholars in the late 19th century who took this subject seriously and wrote about it, including Friedrich Engels, including later in the early 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung, who developed a whole interest in it. So the second wave of feminism began in the 20s in this country when women could give the right to vote, and there was a lot of for women's rights. But then went into a period of darkness where women were left out. Now, another book which influenced me greatly, which led to my second master's degree, was also written by a woman. This woman was the first woman to get a PhD in Egyptology. Her name was Margaret Murray of Great Britain. She was a great disciple of the great Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who was called the father of modern archaeology, the modern Egyptology. She was a loner in the field. Now, it was not many years. I think it's at least 50 years. She got her doctorate in 1903. It was maybe 50 years before another woman got a PhD in Egyptology. And so she was alone in the field with all these chauvinistic male colleagues. But she wrote a landmark book, which I recommend for everyone, called The Splendor That Was Egypt in 1949. Now, because of the problem with her male colleagues, she couldn't come right out and say it. But if you read the book, you'll see that she was indicating strongly that ancient Egypt, even dynastic Egypt, was a matriarchy. So that influenced me greatly. So I began to combine as you said, I had all this interest in Egyptology, which is a whole other discussion we could talk hours about. But at this point, I put it all together. I was denied. I wanted to get into a doctoral program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I was turned down. I actually was a subject of reverse sexism, if you can believe it. This was a very elite program called the History of Consciousness. They would have 300 applicants and only accept 10. 10 of them were women. They didn't accept any men into this program. So I said, okay, I'll accept that because women are being denied. So I came back to San Jose State University to do a second master's degree, as you mentioned. But it was through the Women's Studies Department, which no longer exists. That is gone now. That was popular in the 70s. There are no more women's studies departments. So the subject of my master's thesis was the role and position of women in ancient Egypt. And I stated quite clearly that it was a matriarchy and descent was matrilineal. In fact, I named 5 women for sure. 2, I said maybe. Now I say 7 for sure. Women who took the male role of king in dynastic Egypt without any opposition from male priests. Why? I wasn't going to learn the real truth of that until 1992 when I went to Egypt and met my great teacher, Abdel Hakim Aouyan, who was a feminist, who was teaching about the role of women in Egypt. And so then we come with the title. Every one of us, including myself, has used the word Pharaoh wrong. Starting with the Greeks, who came into Egypt, saw that, and being patriarchal system of themselves, they saw only kings and their sons, men and their sons, and thought it was all dominated by men. So they came up with the word Pharaoh. But as Hakim taught us, and it's in my first book, the term is per-ah. Per meant house. Ah is high house. The per-ah was the woman's house. And here, as I said, I've done 20 tours to Egypt. Every tour I've ever done, I start out my lectures by saying every one of us has used the word wrong, including myself. There were no male pharaohs. Period. End of discussion. There were no male pharaohs. The women were the rulers. The women were the throne. This is why Isis has the throne on her head. She's the one that gives Osiris the right to rule as her brother to become king. Now, Hakim would even say in the early dynasties, like the Old Kingdom, they weren't even kings, but they were the Horus, the male role. And later, as Egypt became dynastic, it became more patriarchal, influenced by the Greeks, by the Romans, by the Persians, by the other cultures that were influencing them. They became kings. But the women decided who was to become king, who they, no word for marriage in their language, no word for husband, no word for wife. Egyptology uses the word chief royal wife, and it's an incorrect translation. And I can tell you what the word is and what it really means. But there were no wives, there were no husbands, there were no marriages. So we used the word consort, who the woman would choose to be her consort would become the king. But it was the Greeks used to make fun of the dynastic Egyptian men. They used to come in and say, oh, an Egyptian man is only the occupant in his woman's house, which was true. Descent was matrilineal. Men in ancient times only lived in their wives. And I'm going to talk about ancient because as my subject has been ancient history and prehistory. As I really studied it in the 70s and got deep into it, I began to realize that we, Homo sapiens sapiens, as we're called today, if we go back at first in the 70s, they were saying that modern man, modern human, only evolved about 45, 50,000 years ago. Well, that's changed radically in the last 50 years. They now say, well, 100,000, well, 200,000. Well, now they're saying Homo sapiens may be as much as 400,000 years old. Well, they've now discovered a new subspecies called Homo denisovan, which goes back 700,000 years. And they were Homo sapiens. Abdel Hakim used to say, we, modern humans, are 1,000,000 years old. And indeed, I absolutely agree. Going back to a creature which is called Homo erectus, which was the first Homo sapiens, which was 1.5 million years ago. So I say to you, and I'm saying to everyone listening, in the majority of this 1.5 million years, we have lived more in matriarchal societies and matrilineal cultures than we have in patriarchy. We're talking with chematology about cycles, and we're in a cycle now called the Age of Amen, which is the age of patriarchy, which only existed in the last 5,000 plus years. So I say to everyone listening, past 10,000 years ago, there were no male gods. There was only the Great Mother. And indeed, in the 70s, more women were writing about it. One anthropologist, who you probably have her book on your shelf, which I can recommend to people, is Maricha Gimbutas, who wrote about the ancient witch cult. There she is. There she is.
Yes, I
She
have a
was the
few of her
first one
books.
who
She's
quote.
fantastic.
Of course, because she talked about witches. Witches not being evil, dark, magical people, but being priestesses who used herbal magic, herbal healing, went back to nature, wanted to go back to the way things were. And the Catholic Church couldn't stand that. And so it's been estimated with the minor estimate, 30 million women. I would say it's more than 100 million women were murdered by the Catholic Church in a series of couple of hundred years for practicing witchcraft, for returning to being priestesses of old. So, you know, being a witch as you are. And so I say to people, we lived longer under matrilineal, matriarchal cultures than we did patriarchy. But it is patriarchy which has given the illusion to people today. So one of my life goals, which I just did another global conference with Jocelyn Starfeather, Jocelyn Mercado, where I talked about the fact that indigenous people today, that we have to listen to the grandmothers, that the original teachers around the campfires 10, 50, 100,000 years ago were the crones, were the grandmothers who would sit around the campfires and tell the stories of creation, tell how the tribe came to be, tell as we humans came human, and everyone listened to the grandmothers. Now, those men who became shamans were the sons and grandsons of these great women. They listened, they said, oh, I love what grandma is saying. I want to continue what grandma is teaching. And they became the male shamans, which of course we're taught today, oh, always the men, the men. Nonsense. I can give you an updated real thing that's just happened in the last couple of years because I says archaeology is my love. And because I got involved with a lot of female archaeologists, and they're back today. Like I say, today, this is why this conference that you're doing is so important, because we're having another wave of feminism now, where a lot of women are taking positions of power in academia and challenging the male patriarchal. So in France, when I did my work with Professor Francois Borde, who was an amazing man, he took me into the painted caves in France, and we saw these wonderful painted caves. Now, the first thing that hit me when I went into these caves was a feeling of reverence and awe. And I knew immediately these were not living spaces. These caves were like temples for initiation. And so they would paint the animals on the caves that they were going to hunt as what they call sympathetic magic, to award, to connect with the animals that they were going to hunt. So it's always been believed, again, the majority of archaeologists who studied this were men, that it was men that did these paintings. Aha. In just the last couple of years, along comes a bunch of female French archaeologists, go into the caves and start looking at them. And one of the things that are very important and significant about these cave paintings is because then we didn't have writing. As we do today, artists sign their paintings. We have Picasso, Cezanne, ba 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 ba. But those days they would have a handprint, and they would use red ochre paint and blow it around the hand, and that's how they would sign their photographs. It's always assumed that the hands were men. Well, these women started to study these prints. And first of all, they said some of the handprints were very small, so they were obviously children. And then they looked at the larger handprints and put their hands in them, and they fit perfectly. So they came to the conclusion, no, it was women who did the cave paintings 30, 50,000 years ago. And the earliest signs of deity we have are what are called Venus figurines in archaeology. First, they were thought to be just 15, 20,000 years old. Now we know they go back 30,000, 50,000 years. And there's no images of any god that has ever been found that's older than 10,000 years. Only the Great Mother. So it is only the Great Mother was all that was worshipped. And again, the resistance some men have is, oh, does that mean that women were on top and men were subjected to and abused? No, not at all. The sacred masculine has always been known, just as the sacred feminine has always been known. Men always knew their place. There was no lesser feeling. They understood that life comes from woman, and life came from the Great Mother. So there was only the worship of the Great Mother. And Eric Newman in the 70s, a disciple of you have his book, The Great Mother. Yeah, he was a disciple of Jung, and he wrote a book. Other men were suddenly catching up with it. I once attended a conference, 1976, at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a goddess conference, because again, that was the wave then. There were 500 women and 8 men. I was one of the 8. So, yes. And another book I would recommend to people, if you haven't had this one, maybe you should, written in the late 1970s by Merlin Stone, called When God Was a Woman. Okay, you know. That's a great book. That led me going to where I went to. That led me to my master's degree. Another woman that people should read, her name was Barbara Lesko. She was a radical feminist in the late 70s. She wrote a pamphlet called The Remarkable Women of Ancient Egypt. That also influenced me so much that I did my master's. Unfortunately, Barbara got her degree at Chicago, which was a great school of Egyptology. She went on to teach at Brown University. She met Leonard Lesko, who was a male Egyptologist. He, in fact, influenced her. The last book she wrote, she backed off saying that Egypt was a matriarchy. She wrote a book about the goddesses of Egypt. It's a great book to count all the goddesses, but she was calling them goddesses. They were not gods and goddesses. The netters, is how it, as my teacher taught, were aspects of the whole. The Egyptians were not worshiping 360 gods and goddesses. They were worshiping the principle of the whole. And they only knew that there was one, the Great Mother. And so you wanted to talk about the Sphinx, and I knew I would get this story in for you because the Sphinx has been my guide all my life. At 8 years old, she contacted me. She led me through the sciences. She led me to become a feminist. She led me to find Hakim. She told me he was the man I was looking for all my life. Here's the story that they tell in the indigenous teachers. There was only Nut, N-U-T. She was the Great Mother. That's all the ancient people knew. But people, she controls what's created and what's uncreated, like Kali in the Vedic tradition. So Hakim would tell the story that when the Great Mother wanted to manifest in physical form on our planet, she spit. And where she spit was a limestone outcropping, which they carved into the Sphinx. So Tef Nut, Tef, the Sphinx today is Tef Nut. Tef means moisture, humidity. It also means saliva. So why, Hakim said, why did they say spit? Well, because I'll use the scientific term. Every time we expectorate, there's no volume, no mass. It can't be weighed. So what they're saying is, you can't define the Great Mother. But if you must, we'll build a statue of her, and she spit. And so Hakim would say, the first day I met him, November 16th, 1992, he was standing in front of the Sphinx, and he said to us all, she, and emphasized, she is 54,000 years old. And that's one of the bases that we have today of chematology. Sphinx was the first, it may be, unless somebody can find something older, the oldest extant statue on our planet today, and it is the Great Mother, Tefnut. And
Yes.
so when the Egyptologists try to teach it's a male king making an offering to the sun, that's absolute nonsense, because the fact of the matter is, a face today was recarved. It's recarved back several times, but it was carved by a man who became the king of Egypt, who was honoring his mother. And his mother was a black African woman who had the title Nithotep. And she is what the Sphinx is today. It's not a male face, it's a woman's face. I can't tell you how many people I brought to Egypt. And I say that, and all women totally vibe with it. They say, oh, yes, she's female. It's female. Sure, it's female. And even some men can recognize it's female. So the Sphinx today is that of a woman's face carved maybe around 2700 BCE into the face of a man honoring his mother who had the title Nihotep. And she's one of the first ones I mentioned as being king. So people today, they go to Egypt and they hear the names of the pharaohs, Ramses, Akhenaten, Tutmosis, Amenhotep. But they don't hear the women's names, which I'll mention right now.
Yeah.
First one, Nitkotep. Second dynasty, the largest tomb. Oh, I'm sorry this is happening. The largest tomb that we have found. I'll just take my phone off and then it won't happen anymore. The largest tomb we have found today in Egyptology is of Second Dynasty. Now they say it's a king, they say Den. Well, King Den was Mernit. So the largest tomb ever found in Egyptian archaeological history is that of a woman. And she was a king in the Second Dynasty. She took the title Den, so they think it's a man. It's not a man. So then you get a name like Nit Akert. Oh, come on. I turned it off. It shouldn't be happening. Okay.
Oh, that's
Oh, I
wonderful,
lost
Stephen.
you.
That's all right. I don't. Oh, yes. I can still see you there. We can
Okay,
still there we go.
I don't know.
Are we there? Okay.